Welcome to On Point. I'm your host, Roger McConnell, and I'll be here every other Tuesday at 1 p.m. with topical shows addressing the needs and concerns of military veterans and active duty personnel. Great Falls recently hosted the State Disabled American Veterans Convention. The keynote speaker was a lady who had earlier appeared in one of the first editions of On Point Veterans Talk Radio. Many of you may remember Diane Carlson Evans. She was a Vietnam field evacuation hospital nurse who later led the crusade for the Vietnam Women's Memorial in Washington, D.C. During her recent speech at the DAV convention, it was dead silent in the conference room. Diane has a way of capturing the attention of an audience. I apologize for the poor sound quality of the recording. However, the presentation is worth airing. I present Diane Carlson Evans.
I'm very honored to be your invited speaker this evening. And I don't know how Joe found me, but he somehow knew that I was a member of the DAV in Minnesota. And so I got an email or a phone call, and would I like to be transferred to Montana? And I said, of course, that would be wonderful. So I am a member of your chapter, and I hope that in subsequent conventions in the future I will be able to attend. I'm very happy that my husband was able to join me this evening. Some of you may have met him under the scalpel at the Fort Harrison VA in Helena. Mike is a veteran. We met in the Army in the intensive care unit in 1970 after Vietnam, and my husband wanted to go to Vietnam and joined the Army. But after his residency was over, 5 years later, the war was over. But for 5 years, he cared for Vietnam veterans as they were coming back from the war, and multiple complications and surgeries. And he's very, very connected to veterans, and he's been my biggest support. He's my hero, and without him, I wouldn't be here tonight, because without him, I couldn't have built the Vietnam Women's Memorial. As Mary said, it takes a lot of people to help make something happen. So, honey, I love you, so thank you for coming with me tonight. To the veterans here, I want to pay tribute to you. You were the young men us nurses cared for so many years ago. And my talk tonight is going to be from the nurse's perspective, because that's who I was during my military service. I stayed in for almost 7 years, 6.5 years, and have been close to veterans ever since. I had unfinished business, I think, after Vietnam, and there was still more work to be done. And so my passion for for all these years has been to do what I can for my fellow veterans. And I also want to thank the family members who are here and the loved ones of veterans. You've stood by our side. You've stood with us, and we're not easy people to be with sometimes, are we? So thank you for the families and the loved ones, because you too have sacrificed and you too have served our country in your support for all of us veterans, and that is so key. So in 1969, I was 22 years old, and a head nurse in a 400-bed evacuation hospital in Pleiku, South Vietnam, that supported the Army's 4th Infantry Division. At that time, as you can imagine, it's 1969, we received unrelenting casualties and from an area of intense fighting near the Cambodian border. Choppers, for those of you who served in Vietnam, you know that the dust-offs often got patients to our hospitals within 15, 20 minutes. If those patients were lucky, they could get to our hospital that quickly. When I left for Vietnam, my father's parting words were, "I have 4 sons, but I send my daughter to Vietnam. I send my daughter off to war." It was July 28, 1968, and I was 21 years old when I left for Vietnam. It was the first time that I could remember that my dad ever held me in his arms, and he cried. His patched blue overalls smelled of sweat and alfalfa. I grew up on a dairy farm in Buffalo, Minnesota. I remember bringing Dad a gallon of iced tea with fresh lemon slices when he worked in the fields. When dinner was ready, I'd stand outside and wave a white dish towel, and Dad would turn his blue 1936 Ford tractor back toward the house. I had never seen my dad cry until the day I left for Vietnam. There's some things you just never forget. My mother was even more stoic than the Scandinavian Lutheran she married. She didn't say she loved me, but I knew she did. Mom just hugged me goodbye and said, "I know you'll be all right. The kids will miss you." In 1884, we have a Civil War buff over here, I know. We just talked to Terry a little bit ago. The Supreme Court Justice at the time, Oliver Wendell Holmes, he reflected on the Civil War and said, "We have shared the incommunicable experience of war. We have felt, we still feel, the passion of life to its top. In our youths, our hearts were touched with fire." Then he went on to say, "It is for us to bear the report to those who come after us." End of his quote. Well, bearing that report is something we can do by sharing our stories. And more than 60 years after the end of World War II, you all know, and we have still so many World War II veterans who are alive, but we're losing them by the thousands every day, how this great effort was taking place to capture their stories before they passed on, because so many of them, like so many veterans, don't want to talk about it, haven't shared stories, their experiences with their families or with the public. So getting them on tape, on record, to share their stories. People realize the profound importance of hearing the stories of the generation as we're losing them. So I believe that it's important that we get our stories out when we can. And now we have our Korean and Vietnam veterans, and as Moses said, our legacy. Moses talked about our legacy and how important our legacy is. And what is our legacy? It's our stories. So tonight, I'll bear the report a bit about my own story, which is mostly about you, the Vietnam veteran, the soldier the military nurses were sent to care for. Like many of those boys who returned to America as silent men, they went as boys, but they came home men. For years, I too didn't speak much of what I had seen in the war. Many of us were quick to say, "Oh, it wasn't all bad." Mostly we just didn't want to talk about it. It would be like describing a nightmare. Still, I can look out upon the hospital ward and clearly see what was before me. My eyes follow the rows and rows of beds covered with olive green malaria netting. I notice those that are empty. I walk softly past the patients in blue pajamas. I hear subdued cries of pain and can still smell the heated stench of Pseudomonas infections. I see patients watching my movements. Some need my attention and signal for me to come to their side. Others turn their faces to the wall. I believe that all are reassured and comforted knowing there are American nurses there, near them in the night, in the morning when they awake, and in their memories when returning to the field. They know that they may return here, to this hospital, wounded again, the only place in Vietnam where there was a glimmer of hope and some sanity in the combat zone, and that was in an American hospital. For yes, war is hell, and this hellishness explains some of the things people do when get caught up in it. When I looked into the eyes of some of these soldiers, I did not see the devil. Their eyes were gone to other places, that 1,000-yard stare. They had seen and done unspeakable things, and I knew they were not the same boys who had left home. It is March of 1969 in the Central Highlands of Pleiku, about 30 kilometers from the Cambodian border. I was a head nurse in our 400-bed evacuation hospital that supported the 4th Infantry Division. There we received unrelenting casualties. The division was being overrun by the Viet Cong and the NVA. Their wounded were maybe 10 minutes away from dust-off helicopters. Pleiku was the epicenter of fighting that spring. and our hospital, a partially bunkered complex of one-story wooden structures surrounded by guard towers and concertina wire, came under frequent attack. Though we worked in shifts, there was no real escape from the 24 hours a day mission. There was the adrenaline rush, the fetid smells, the sound of motor thuds, of rockets and shrapnel piercing our hospital roof and walls, and as we threw mattresses on top of the patients who hadn't already dived for the floor. I could hear the choppers coming in, the whop-whop of the rotor blades. Not one chopper, but 2, 3, how many? This was trouble. It was not a familiar chopper sound, and it wasn't the usual Huey dust-off. This was something else. A Chinook. The sounds of mass casualties erupted. The telephone in my hooch was ringing. Lieutenant Carlson, report immediately to Ward 7 and open it up for incoming casualties. It was an empty ward, the spare, for just such emergencies. My surgical unit that I had just left and all the other units were already full. The chief nurse said that mixed in with the wounded was an undetermined number of men with severe dehydration, possibly food or water poisoning. While I was pulling on my fatigues and boots, the red alert siren started its shrill, high-pitched screaming. No, I didn't grab for a weapon because nurses were not issued weapons. But a few nurses packed their own. After the red alert, the next sound is usually incoming rounds. My mind is screaming because I'm pulled out of half sleep with the sounds of chaos surrounding me. I grab my helmet and flak jacket and I run to the hospital. I don't remember being afraid of being killed, even though I knew the bullets weren't marked with no nurses. But I do remember that dreaded sense of anxiety, of not wanting to watch young men suffer and die. That dread of not knowing what was coming next. Somehow we went to Vietnam thinking we had to carry the whole load, that people's lives around us depended on how smart we were, how quick we learned, how brave we were, how awake we were to every clue of what was going on, that heightened sense of alertness, an underlying worry that the slightest mistake would jeopardize the situation at hand and affect somebody's life. The corpsmen are already bringing litters of groaning men to the unit I'm to open. Because of the red alert, the lights are out. It is pitch black, and I smell the hot stench of sweat, vomit, diarrhea, and the compost of jungle rot. I hear the big guns off in the distance, artillery. Is it incoming or outgoing? At this point, it doesn't matter because it's both. I asked the corpsman, how many? He said he didn't know and replied, Lieutenant, it's just you and me. All the extra hands are in the emergency room with the wounded. I asked him to stay by my side and hold the flashlight. We're not doing anything until all the IVs are started. The ward is now full. Every bed is full. I began with the boy in the first bed. While I'm preparing the needle and the IV, I said, you're going to be okay now. I asked him, how many days have you been out there? How are you? He looked at me with that hollow, blank look I was now very familiar with. I hadn't heard of the 1,000-yard stare yet, but that's what it was. He was severely dehydrated and hypotensive. His skin was pale and dry and coated with days of grime. I quickly assessed the grave danger of all of these young men in a war over which we had no control. It was live or die. I was part of a generation that was dying. It is said that there are 2 kinds of people on the battlefield, the quick and the dead. The constant desire to be fast, go to the next and the next and the next, kept the adrenaline pumping until we became addicted to our own drug, adrenaline. I felt like such a small, insignificant speck in the grand scheme of the universe, yet there I was, one lone nurse, like Moses, his poem, one. I was one lone nurse and one lone corpsman. with who knows how many young men waiting for some life-saving measures. I never forgot the look on that first boy's face. Certainly he had resigned himself to meeting his maker in that hellhole, while the thin line of losing the game of life was just hours away. And for me, to be so privileged to be there with him and the others in that most golden of all moments is something inexplicable. I never did learn if it was bad water, food poisoning, or really what the origin of their near-death experience was. But I know what they went through, and no Purple Hearts were handed out as badges to identify their suffering, or that this too could have been a mortal wound. While I cared for these young men in Vietnam, thousands of other nurses, doctors, and medics were doing the same. That was a time when most of us knew that all we had was each other, and we were there to get each other home alive. Around us nurses were the soldiers, you, standing guard for us, in towers, weapons at hand, at gates, at perimeters, at the perimeter, the door gunners and the pilots on the choppers which took us on assignments, making certain the nurses and all the women and medical personnel serving in Vietnam got safely to where they needed to be. We thank you. When our hospital and hooches were hit one night, thousands of more sandbags were packed around them the next day by sweating GIs. We were there to save you. You were there to save us. The moral dilemma of the war, the right or wrong of it, was not something we could change. We couldn't end the war. But what we could do, the one right thing, while some of us doubted our government and military strategy, was to get each other home alive. That was our mission. Our government never did give us a clear goal, in my opinion, but we each had our own personal one, and that was watching out for each other. In the end, when the last flag-draped coffin returns home, the dust has settled and memories begin to fade, a movement to honor and remember those lost begins. And the ultimate questions: who gets memorials? Where are they dedicated? What do they say? What and who do they portray? These become highly charged political issues. We women shared the tragedy of the spilled blood of our brother soldiers. Honoring them is more than an act of gratitude and respect. It affirms that the details and the truth matter. No matter why soldiers are put in harm's way, it is appropriate to honor those willing to die for each other. The wall of names, the statue of the 3 servicemen, the symbolic figures of the Vietnam Women's Memorial creates a gathering place for not only honoring and remembering, but hearing the stories that serve as living history, when bearing the report is not only cathartic for the teller, but a responsibility. For again, those details matter. It is who we are. Wherever American men and women are sent, they will do what they've been trained to do, and they will put their lives on the line for one another. The storm of the Vietnam War is over, but there's another war going on around the world that isn't over. There are fires going on around the world for our soldiers serving today, our warriors serving today. For us veterans, the fires no longer rage like they once did, but most of us are left with the smoldering memories, which spark to keep us doing all we can for our veterans and for the remembrance of these soldiers, the living and the dead. American poet Archibald MacLeish and Librarian of Congress was an ambulance driver and later a captain in an artillery unit in World War I. His younger brother was killed serving there, and he is buried at Flanders. In his poem, The Dead Young Soldiers, Archibald MacLeish have the soldiers in the poem tell us, we leave you our deaths. The young dead soldiers do not speak. Nevertheless, they are heard in the still houses. Who has not heard them? They have a silence that speaks for them at night. And when the clock counts, they say, we were young. We have died. Remember us. They say, we have done what we could, but until it is finished, it is not done. They say, we have given our lives, but until it is finished, no one can know what our lives gave. They say, our deaths are not ours, they are yours. They will mean what you make of them. They say, whether our lives and our deaths were for peace and a new hope or for nothing, we cannot say. It is you who must say this. We leave you our deaths, give them meaning. We were young, they say. We have died. Remember us. In that imaginary monologue written by McLeish, these young soldiers ask for two things. Remember me and give my death meaning. That hasn't changed in any war. There's another imaginary monologue, and it's of my fellow Army nurse, Sharon Lane, who was killed in Vietnam while I was there. Colonel Maud Smith, an old Army nurse who was in World War II, Korea and Vietnam, wrote a poem for Sharon after her death. And this is what she writes. I am Lieutenant Lane. Do you remember me? I was taken from your midst beyond the China Sea. Yes, I am Sharon Lane, and I am here with them, the very many thousand valiant young men. I am with them now where it is ever more serene. In the cause of freedom, in man's epic search for truth, we only plead that you will think it carefully through before another brutal war claims other young folk too. I was caring for a soldier, leaning over his bed. A piece of shrapnel struck my neck. In seconds, I was dead. I didn't even have a chance to breathe a quick goodbye, to gesture or scream, or to say a prayer or cry. It happened very suddenly, a long time ago, and I am not regretful. I do want you to know. Enjoy Earth's awesome wonder the while that you are here. Yes, I am Sharon Lane. Love binds me to you yet, as it does the gallant men, lest you forget. I was proud of the men I served, that I cared for in Vietnam and during my years in the Army Nurse Corps. I was proud of the women and the men whom I served beside, and I still carry that pride. I saw how these young men suffered, I saw how they died, and then I saw how this country treated them when I returned. During the 1970s and the 80s, when Vietnam veterans are struggling with Agent Orange poisoning, they're struggling with complications, physical complications from their war injuries, and they have something yet to be identified, which we now know as post-traumatic stress disorder. These veterans, thanks to people like those in the Disabled American Veterans, went to Congress and demanded help and said, we are suffering, we need help. And when we started doing that, Vietnam veterans were called crybabies. Some of you will remember that. It was an unpopular war, and we were unpopular veterans. But Vietnam veterans fought just as hard as they fought in Vietnam. And we have a breakthrough in the VA that we can thank Vietnam veterans for, and that is the vet centers, which the first one opened in 1979, which recognized the emotional trauma of war. It was a milestone for all future veterans. Our veterans coming home today, and now it's opened up to active duty soldiers, sailors, airmen and women, Marine, everyone. The vet center concept has saved thousands and thousands of lives. And it's because we had to use our voice. We had to step up and say, We need help. We need services. But it was veterans helping veterans that made this happen. And it was veterans who built the memorials in Washington, D.C. and all around the country. The politicians did not build these veterans, the memorials. The government did not build these memorials. We carried on the tradition after the war that we had served in by taking care of each other. And for that, I'm very proud of veterans. To the rest of the world, we Vietnam veterans, I think, want to leave a glimpse into our souls and offer hope to others suffering from wounds. We never wanted to see another generation of men and women coming home from war to an unpopular, to a country that did not support them and abandon them like they had been abandoned. And we have seen a complete change in our country because of that. Thankfully. Ours is a legacy not only of serving our nation, but also of recognizing and treating the traumatic injuries of the mind and the soul, which we now know is critical to readjustment and survival. We cannot stress enough that healing does not happen alone. We do it together. And it comes from talking to each other, from understanding, support, compassion, education, and advocacy. It always has been and always will be how much we care about each other that will win all of our battles and triumph over tragedy in the civilian and military environment. I thank you. It's wonderful to be here with all of you. I want to just add one comment before I leave you, and that is when I was studying nursing in Minneapolis, I wanted to go over to the VA and do my nursing internship at a VA hospital because in my mind I was thinking, I'm going to join the Army, I'm going to go to Vietnam. This was something that was underneath my skin thinking about. And I took care of World War I veterans in 1967. And they were just the most amazing inspiration to me. I will never forget them. And I wanted to know all about their stories. I could not get enough of hearing. I would talk to these old guys, what's your story? It was like, and if you're interested in them, they will talk. Like if you really want to know my story, yes, tell me your story. They would just open up and talk. And all those World War I veterans, of course, they're all gone now. The last one passed away. But it's just, I guess what I want to say is when we're veterans, it doesn't matter what generation, what era we served in. We are veterans, and there's just this common bond. It doesn't matter the uniform that we wore or the branch of service, but it's our humanity. We've served our country. We're proud of serving our country. And like the Disabled American Veterans as a service organization, and our national service officers and our state service officers, we pull together out of that love and compassion and passion that we have for each other and for our nation. So I love you all. Thank you. And I look forward to seeing more of you in the future.
This is On Point Veterans Talk Radio, and you're listening to Diane Carlson Evans' keynote speech at the recent State Disabled American Veterans Convention here in Great Falls. On Point continues to air every other Tuesday at 1 p.m. on Montana Public Radio, KGPR, Great Falls. If you have any questions, comments, or ideas for future shows, please contact me, Roger McConnell, at 406-799-6709 or an email onpointkgpr@bresnan.net.